Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
If we can find a way to get a cessation of the conflict and a release of the hostages and a political discussion emerges from it, there's this is going to take years and years to unfold, and we're still the last best chance for the region to find a way forward.
Welcome to Voternomics, where politics and markets collide. This year, voters around the world have the ability to affect markets, countries and economies like never before. So we've created this series to help you make sense of it all. I'm Stephanie Flanders.
And I'm Allegra Stratton, and Adrian Wooldridge is normally with us, but this week we think he's recuperating from anchoring Friday's episode on his own.
And very good job he did too. At the top of the show, you heard from our guest this week, Daleep Singh. Daleep is the Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics in the White House. That's a role in the Biden administration that he returned to earlier this year after working for a shortish stint as chief global economist at PGIM. This is a guy who's been very much associated with the geo-economics, with the sort of Bidenomics piece of the US administration's international policy over the last few years, carving out what economic statecraft in this new world means. And one area that I asked him about was the Middle East, a place where you would have said there was a positive argument for economic diplomacy actually forging a more peaceful, sustainable outlook. You would have said that a year ago, you would have said that any time up to October 7th, but talking about it now, extremely difficult. So what he had to say about that, what he had to say about the sanctions against Russia that he was very much part of crafting, and of course China, was all pretty interesting.
It was really interesting, and you're completely right. It was particularly interesting for his tone. And as somebody who used to do interviews from government, I did sympathise quite a few times with the tension, because he's trying to choose exactly the right word for somebody who's actually crafting public policy from government. As you were speaking to him, Stephanie, it's high stakes, and it was incredibly interesting for that reason too.
And he's an economist that is now in the crosshairs of some of the biggest kind of geopolitical and most sensitive issues facing the US right now, whether it is the Middle East. When we spoke, he'd also just imposed, or helped the administration just impose, a load of new tariffs on Chinese goods. So there was plenty to talk about. It was a couple of weeks ago. Nothing's happened to really outdate anything he said, but it's always important to mention that. We've got so many elections to talk about in this episode. We're going to have to talk about them pretty briefly, but we are going to have a little chat with one of our colleagues in New Delhi about the Indian election, where polling indicates that the Prime Minister Narendra Modi's party is going to win a majority for the third time in a row. But before we get to all that, I guess those who did listen to Adrian's episode at the end of last week, he spoke to our economist, Yvonne Miango, about the state of play in the South African election. We've obviously now had the results, and I was pretty struck actually, because Yvonne had put a number in my mind, which was that anything under 45 would be quite a bad result for the ANC, 45% of the vote. And actually it looks like it's going to be closer to 40, and it does have some coalition building to do now.
They're going to be scrabbling around. Cyril Ramaphosa is going to have to contend with the return of his nemesis, Jacob Zuma. I'm interested, Steph, in how voters, what decisions they made in that central coal belt in South Africa. I think it's sort of too soon to say, as we often say in these situations, but whether or not the fact that they had constant shutdowns of electricity, how that impacted their decision and their view of the ANC and the ruling government, versus the move that is afoot in the international community to get South Africa to transition from these coal power plants to renewable energy.
I was struck by actually one of our columnists, Justice Malala, who had spoken in the lead up to the election as this being a result that could, in a sense, mark the sort of normalising of South Africa's democracy. You know, it's not normal for a country to get 60, 70% of the vote, as ANC has in many years after the end of apartheid. You've had now this fracturing of the party, far left elements breaking off, Jacob Zuma's party breaking off, And at least Justice Malala says, the key thing now for many people would be what he says is avoiding what's known as a doomsday coalition. So avoiding a coalition with those more far left parts of the, if you like, the former ANC party. And instead, what needs to happen, at least according to him, is a coalition with the white-led opposition Democratic Alliance, which is led by a woman, Helen Ziller, who he says is crotchety, pugilistic and controversial, but a very effective political operator. And the important thing about that would be, again, to cement the normalising of South Africa's democracy, hands across the racial aisle, however you want to talk about it. That would be as force for market reforms, potentially for economic growth, would be positive for investors worried about what's going to happen with the budget. But I think it would also be a rejection of very kind of race-based dividing lines.
And it's interesting as well because it's pure votenomics, right? What's going on in South Africa, where you have people's lived experience dealing with these energy shutdowns, and then this high level of unemployment as well as violence and so on, and that expressing itself, as you say, Steph, for the first time in the history of it as a democracy at the polls.
So we are going to wait and see what happens there, but I think certainly a lot of investors will be hoping that you have what would historically be quite an unlikely coalition with the DA. The other thing that's happened with the other major emerging market democracy to have got a change of leadership is, of course, Mexico.
Yeah. And its first female president in a landslide victory, though she does appear, it's well known that she is the anointed heir to the incumbent, the previous leader. And it seems like for her, the big issues in her tray are the extreme violence in Mexico. 38 candidates were killed in this election.
The violence, the cartel violence, the control over different parts of the country is extraordinary. I do find in these conversations, and it happens, it's almost like a split screen conversation that seems particularly acute when you're at Bloomberg, that on the one hand, our reporters are reporting about this basic level of lawlessness, particularly outside Mexico City, caused by the cartels, caused by drug violence. You also have President Trump talking very aggressively about sending people back to Mexico, potentially sending American troops, if he wins the election, into Mexico to prevent immigration, but also to tackle the drugs issue. And yet, almost in the same breath, we'll have investors, market analysts talking about what a great bet Mexico is. Mexico is going to be one of these countries that benefits enormously from a more regionalized global economy, people turning away from China, wanting to have a closer connection, be closer to America. And I just find that extraordinary. And she's inheriting that sort of two-sided
schizophrenia
legacy. And Andres Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, who's been the president all this time, was an extraordinary figure. He's very kind of 70s style populist who's actually the world kind of moved in his direction, more interventionist, quite into building up the domestic energy industry. And it's interesting because she's kind of inherited that slightly populist tradition, yet she herself is a social scientist, apparently doesn't take a lot of risks. It's going to be interesting to watch. There's way too much to talk about, but I think we do want to go to that other country, which is considered to be a great potential beneficiary of a world that's diversifying away from China, and that is India. And we're going to hear from our senior editor there in New Delhi, Ruchi Bhatia. Ruchi, always lovely to hear you. We think we're about to get the formal result of this election. I guess never really in doubt that Narendra Modi's party was going to win convincingly. But what have we learnt from this campaign, or what have you been surprised by?
Hi, Stephanie. It's always great to be on the podcast with you. The temperature is certainly soaring in New Delhi, not just because of the hot weather, but because the exit polls over the weekend showed that Prime Minister Narendra Modi's party is set to get a decisive majority in the Indian elections for a third time over, which makes him the only Prime Minister after Jawaharlal Nehru to have, to have ruled the country for that long a period. Jawaharlal Nehru, remember, ruled India for 17 years after independence, and Modi managing a third consecutive term in power really shows how popular he is as a leader. In fact, one has to look into the fact that the party's manifesto itself was centered around Modi. He has gone to these elections on the back of India's almost 8% growth, a very, very strong set of growth numbers, very strong economy, and also the fact that his Hindu nationalist policies have been extremely popular with the leaders. Having said that, one must caution our listeners that exit polls have had a mixed track record in the Indian elections, and it is only in 2014 and 2019 that we saw that exit polls were somewhere close to the actual results. When it's only then that we'll know how things really shape up.
Ruchi, you talked just there about the 8% growth that India's experiencing, and clearly that will have had something to do with Modi's what looks like thumping victory. But for everyday Indians, is that the case? Is it the case that they've experienced this great economic growth?
Well, yes and no, because we have seen how Modi has pledged to make India a developed country by 2047, which would be India's 100 years of independence. However, that the benefits of that growth have not been equal. They have been unequal, if I can put it like that, because the rich in the country are still getting richer, the poor only getting poorer. In fact, we have seen that there is wide inequality in India, and which is why in Prime Minister Narendra Modi's third term, he will have to focus on some of these issues. I must also mention that we have seen that this 8% growth that he's the developed country by 2047 aim that he's talking about, that would mean that the country grows at an 8% pace for the next 25 years. And that's going to be a very, very tall ask.
We were just talking about Mexico and there being a slightly sort of two-way conversation that people have about Mexico, nervous on some aspects, but also potentially seeing Mexico as a place to put money. I mean, if you look at India, you have this very rapid growth rate, a lot of optimism about India as the sort of alternative to China driving global growth, and certainly with the labour force growth that could sort of fill the gap left by China. But at the same time, a lot of unease, the way that Narendra Modi has to some extent suppressed opposition, Delhi's chief minister being arrested on corruption charges a couple of months ago, foreign investors actually pulling money out, at least at the margins of India, I saw was highlighted by The Economist magazine this week because of nervousness around sort of lack of clarity around tax rules and treatment of foreign investment. So do you sense that sort of ambivalence that on this is a vote for market reforms, and in that sense investors should be happy, but policymakers and investors uneasy about Prime Minister Modi having such a clear run and such a personalized rule of this country?
I mean, absolutely. In fact, if you look at the fact that how the markets reacted, the NSE Nifty index rallying as much as 3.6%, the bond and rupee markets also faring pretty well in today's trade, which goes on to show that this is a big boost coming in for India's economic growth by investors. They feel that there will be a lot of market reforms that Modi perhaps may take in his third term. And all these definitely add to being the big positives for India. But having said that, there have been a lot of questions on Modi's track record on various social and political factors as well. So all those things will have to be watched out very carefully.
Ruchi, just describe for us the extreme heat that people have had to endure when going to the polls. Nearly 50 degrees.
Oh, absolutely. As I started by saying that the temperature is certainly soaring in New Delhi. We've seen a lot of heat wave related deaths. It's going to have a massive impact on the Indian economy as well. And also, remember, the polling season was a 6 week long polling season that we saw here in India. And after the first phase, the temperatures climbed up significantly. And there were worries that perhaps a lot of voters were not going in to cast their votes. So the heat wave definitely a big issue here. But the good part I must mention is the fact that we're getting some sort of a relief from the fact that monsoons have also hit at the right time, and we're going to be watching out for the kind of distribution that monsoons have in the next. In the next couple of months, and that will really define how the agriculture economy really fares going forward.
Ruchi Bhatia in New Delhi, thank you so much for joining us. Let's get on to my very interesting conversation with Daleep Singh, the United States Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics in the White House. Daleep, among many other things, was a key architect of those unprecedented sanctions that were imposed on Russia after its invasion of Ukraine in 2022. A lot of conversation about how effective those sanctions have been, given that Russia has continued to make a lot of money from selling its oil. So I started the conversation by asking him whether he thinks the sanctions are working.
So the way I always think about policy is, how does it look relative to the counterfactuals? So relative to the counterfactual of doing nothing, of allowing the redrawing of borders by force in the heart of Europe to go unchecked. No doubt the sanctions are doing their job. Admittedly, it's not the nosedive that I predicted 2 years ago, but I would not mistake Russia's rebound for resilience. If I had to classify it, I'd say it's another Potemkin facade, because what Putin has done is to prevent a collapse of the economy in the short term by sacrificing Russia's long-run potential. That's what capital controls do. They limit the flow of money getting out, and therefore they prevent the free fall of the ruble and the collapse of the financial system. But there's a cost, which is the isolation of Russia from most of the advanced economies in the world. If you look at the imports from Western countries to Russia, they've nosedived by about 75% since the war. I would make the same point in terms of the effect of Russia weaponizing its energy supply. Yes, it led to a spike of oil and gas prices. That drove record trade surpluses. It flattered GDP growth, but at the cost of permanently losing well over half of its global market share in energy exports. And then the third step he took was to ramp up government spending to fuel the war machine. And, it's up to 8% of GDP. I think that's a post-Soviet record. Yes, that cushioned the contraction, but here again, at the cost of depleting Russia's national savings, it set Russia on a course for the policy rate's now 16%, I believe. Inflation's close to 8%, and they're going to have chronic budget deficits. So, look, Stephanie, I think reasonable people can disagree about Russia's short-term prospects, but there's no doubt that Russia's long-term outlook is bleak. That's what nosebleed interest rates and inflation do. They choke growth. So will the exit from Russia of more than 1,000 multinationals. So will the flight of up to 1 million of Russia's best and brightest. And so will the loss of access to global capital markets and leading edge technology. So I think this is still going to be a smaller, weaker, more isolated, less sophisticated economy for a generation.
Of course, it was never going to stop Russia from being able to pursue the war, but a lot of goods are going over the border through Azerbaijan, other places, and there's a lot of trade going there from countries that are part of the sanctions regime. I noticed in February, UK sold £26 million worth of luxury cars to Azerbaijan, which, as of a couple of years ago, we probably sold about 2. So how much are you actively trying to plug those kind of entry points, or is that just impossible without making a lot of enemies?
No, this is very much our focus because, necessity is the mother of invention. And we knew Russia would try to evade sanctions by exploiting loopholes. And that's what they're doing. And we have to prepare over the medium and long run for a cat and mouse game if we want to sustain the impact of the sanctions that we put in place a couple of days after the war began. You're pointing to where we have to focus, and it's disarming the Russian war machine. That, to me, is really a lot of supply chain analysis. What are the components, the inputs that are currently making the biggest difference for Russia on the battlefield? So think of UAVs or ammunition or heavy engineering equipment or armored vehicles. And then if you take those battlefield advantages, we're mapping out the supply chains that provide the advantage, including the raw materials and the precursors. And look, China is very much part of this conversation because it's been willing to serve as the factory of the Russian war machine in a very real sense. And if you look at the trade data, Russia's imports from the G7 countries has collapsed by about 75%, but imports from China have more than tripled. It's now more than half of all of Russia's imports. And microchips, machine tools, optics, cruise missile components, weapons propellants are all part of what's being bought by Russia from China. Just to give you a stat, in 2023, 90% of Russia's microchips came from China. And those microchips were used for missiles, tanks, aircraft. Many battlefield advantages came from those chips. 70% of Russia's machine tool imports came from China in Q4 of 2023. So we have issued warnings, we have written letters, and it may be time soon for us to provide a demonstration effect of our seriousness.
I shouldn't laugh at the thought of sending letters, but when you think of the sort of the full force of the United States, writing lots of letters, I mean, what comes next?
Well, I mean, I know it may sound funny to issue letters, but I mean, the best sanctions are those that never have to get used.
Who is it you're writing to when you write the letters?
Oh, so the relevant authorities in the countries from which transshipment is occurring or these components are originating. If there are diminishing returns to sending signals and having conversations, then you follow it up with action. And those actions can generate a chilling effect that's many multiples larger than the direct impact. And that's where we are in this conflict. We've got to find ways to disarm the Russian war machine. And then we've got to turn our attention in parallel, really, to defunding it. And that really points to where his income is coming from. And that's energy. Stephanie, we implemented a price cap to exert leverage from our dominant position in oil services. And the design was calibrated to limit the price at which Putin could sell his oil using those services so that we could reduce his revenues while keeping steady the supply of oil to global markets. Well, everyone knows now he's adapted by launching a shadow fleet that doesn't use G7 oil services. And so now we've got to find ways to increase the cost of using his shadow fleet, force him back into the price cap coalition's ecosystem. And that's where we have the bargaining power to drive down his marginal revenues relative to marginal cost. So disarm and defund the Russian war machine, that's our focus now.
Is that G7 action? What kind of places are you looking to act further on?
Well, I'm going to be vague because we're not in the business of telegraphing exactly what we do. But in a general sense, first, we want to shift more of the activity from the shadow fleet to within the price cap coalition. Within the price cap coalition, we have a number of levers that we can use, again, to reduce his revenues while keeping supply steady. I think you're probably familiar with what those levers are, but I don't want to be specific here.
And one of the positive side effects of sanctions that sort of looked like it was potentially going to happen over the last year was for the seized Russian assets to provide, in one way or another, financial support for Ukraine. Where do we stand on that?
I think it's worth saying, Stephanie, why we feel justified in mobilizing Russia's assets for the benefit of Ukraine. I mean, I start from the principle that Russia should pay for the burden of rebuilding the country that it's terrorized on a colossal scale. Second, I mean, the precedent of imposing compensation claims after a wrongful invasion, that was set long ago, most recently after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. The third point is Russia has profited to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars from higher energy prices since the war began, in part because it weaponized its supply. So any claim that Russia is Weimar Germany is completely bogus in my view. And four, look, the goal of forcing Russia to pay, it's not to punish, it's to finance a rebuild in Ukraine that will likely cost more than $500 billion, maybe multiples of that amount. So the question really is, how should that burden get financed? Should it be solely on the back of Western taxpayers or the people of Ukraine? I mean, the answer is, of course not. The Kremlin has to pay its fair share. So, what are we doing? We have a G7 leaders summit. That to me is the action forcing event in the near term. We all know the situation on the battlefield remains very difficult right now. By the time our leaders gather in Apulia, it may get worse. There is still a large financing gap in Ukraine, even after taking into account our 61 billion supplemental package, even after the EU's 50 billion euro facility. The external financing gap, if you include military needs, on top of budget and balance of payment support, it could be close to $100 billion. So the G7 summit really is the best opportunity before November to close the gap. And we know, I mean, you alluded to this in your question, the seizure of principal, we know that's a red line for certain G7 members. We also know that loans to Ukraine that are backed by reparation claims is an unattractive idea for at least a couple of member states due to the messy history. And we know fiscal space is scarce for every member state. So we are working on a proposal that makes maximal use of the present value of the interest income that you can generate from the immobilized assets. And the way to really get maximal use is to offer an upfront disbursement to Ukraine on the basis of assurances that the interest income from the immobilized assets will be available to repay it. And that upfront disbursement can be as large as $50 billion or more, depending on how many years of interest income you bring forward.
It sounds like there might be movement on that at the G7 summit.
I mean, I think so, because what we've done is we've listened to our partners, we've understood their red lines, and we're now making maximal use of what we can do within those constraints. We want it to be done with solidarity, but we also want to have the flexibility to mobilize the rest of the assets that we froze if we want to later. So that's what we're working towards.
We have finally managed to get the military support passed through Congress. But if you look at what's happening on the battlefield now, do you just worry sort of almost at a personal level that has come too late for Ukraine?
Well, I was just in Kyiv a few weeks ago, and I mean, it is a dire situation in terms of air defense, in terms of manpower, and you see what's happening in the Northeast and to the energy infrastructure more generally. But I think there's a chance for a psychological inflection point, not just and I don't mean to overemphasize psychology, but if you can connect the dots and almost draw an arc between the EU's $50 billion facility, the US $61 billion facility, the G7 summit, where if we mobilize $50 billion, that adds to the sum that we've already raised so far this year. And then you have the NATO summit. You can create a positive inflection point if all of those events go as we hope. And then you can imagine a path for Ukraine in which it's able to outlast Putin, regardless of what happens in the elections in the US or anywhere else for the rest of the year. And that really has the best chance of shaping Putin's calculus and ultimately giving Ukraine leverage to pursue whatever path it wants.
China, one of the big announcements we've seen from the administration recently is a lot of new tariffs on Chinese goods, including an increase in the tariff on Chinese electrical vehicles to over 100%. And I guess to remind listeners, a tariff is just a tax which is levied on goods imported from another country. So you're massively increasing the cost of what were previously quite cheap EVs. Why do you want to discourage Americans from buying EVs by making them so much more expensive?
Well, I think you have to start this conversation with a diagnosis of the geo-economic backdrop, Stephanie, because it's often missing in these discussions around tariffs. And if you start from a diagnosis that President Xi's ambition is to restore China's hegemony, at least in the Indo-Pacific, but I would argue beyond, I would say he's seeking that dominance mostly through economic and technological primacy. And, as a corollary, he sees the U.S. in particular, but democracies in general, as being in structural decline. And he's willing to take tactical risks to realize his strategic ambition. If you take that as a diagnosis, then it follows that China's economic model is going to become increasingly state-led and centralized. And the trend line is not going to change because market-oriented reforms require a loss of control that President Xi is not willing to accept. And that all means that China's growth strategy is going to remain underpinned by state-owned enterprises and national champions that rely on unrivaled levels of government subsidies, discriminatory regulations, currency distortions, weak energy and labor standards, and sometimes theft. That's all to say the basis for our strategy follows from that diagnosis. And it's not centered around tariffs. It's centered around investments at home to strengthen and scale our productive capacity. The second leg of it is partnerships abroad with countries that are playing by the same rules, so we can give each other access to our productive capacity and our purchasing power. But yeah, I mean, regrettably, the third leg is the use of restrictive tools when necessary, and tariffs are one of those tools. And we use them with trading partners that are not playing by the same rules. And we do so to prevent our investments from getting undercut. You know, you asked about EVs in particular. The question of shouldn't we just decarbonize as fast as possible and let every Chinese EV into the U.S.? We all love low prices. I mean, and no doubt we want to decarbonize as fast as we can. But I would say Risk Management 101 says we shouldn't be dependent on a single supplier for a critical good. That was the lesson we learned globally after the pandemic. It was the lesson Europe was reminded of after Russia weaponized its gas flows. I mean, it was the lesson we learned after the first China shock. So, I mean, the point I'm making, Stephanie, is cost is not all that matters if you want to sustain decarbonization. Clean energy has to be reliably sourced. It has to be robust to geopolitical conflict. Clean energy should be created with clean inputs, not coal-fired power plants. And I mean, the polysilicon and solar wafers can't be made with forced labor. So the last point I'll make is if you want to make the transition to clean energy sustainable, it does have to pass political muster. I mean, people quip, and it's right, climate change is a global problem, but policy choices are made at the national level. And so the economic benefits of making this transition, they have to outweigh the costs across political cycles. And that does require attention to whether the strategy is a net contributor to jobs and investment in growth and productivity.
You have, I think, a one exemption or potential exemption in the solar sector to help domestic solar producers not be affected by these. But did you consider having more exclusions or easing up on some of the Trump tariffs as part of this? Well,
I think it's important to know that of the $18 billion in tariffs, $11 billion of the tariffs don't go into effect until 2026. And the remainder are split in terms of implementation dates across 2024 and 2025. And there will be exclusions if there are supply chain disruptions that were unanticipated, if the private sector needs more time to adjust, we'll certainly be attentive to those concerns. So this was really designed in order to allow us to make a transition to domestic production, but also production from partners who are, again, adhering to similar rules of competition to allow them to scale up and, again, not to get flooded by a production trajectory in China that's many multiples of any plausible estimate of global demand.
If Chinese companies right now can just, in fact, they are going to Mexico to make electric vehicles there, and then those can just ship straight to the US, what are you going to do about that? I mean, it seems like a massive loophole.
Well, right. This is one tool of many in the toolkit. So we also have an executive order that's looking at national security risks from connected cars. That's an ongoing investigation, but that's another tool that could be deployed for the circumstance that you're describing. USMCA is set for review in 2026, and part of that discussion could involve, greenfield factories that are being built. Yes, that's the trade agreement between the U.S. and Canada. We can review the scope of the rules in USMCA and apply it to the current and future context. And there are other trade tools that we can deploy as well that have not been used in quite some time.
We've talked about sanctions and then we've talked about tariffs, and which are both, sticks. But I know that you in particular are sort of focused on also thinking about how do we give people a more positive vision of economic statecraft. It's not all about being punished, that you actually have reason to want to be part of the team, a part of the sort of multilateral system that the US supports. So, how do you see the Biden administration actually proceeding on that? Because it sort of does feel like a lot of the positive elements about reaching out to developing countries and all of those things have not progressed as fast as the more sort of stick-based things that we've been talking about.
It's harder because, when you're talking about executive orders that put in place sanctions or export controls or tariffs or price caps or investment restrictions, that can flow through the executive branch, and you can run it relatively quickly. But when you're talking about developing or reimagining or inventing positive tools of statecraft, that typically requires money. And so that's a different kind of process that requires Congress and engaging the broader public so that we can boost our financial firepower. But you're right. I mean, I am very focused on the question of whether we're striking the right balance in the use of restrictive tools of statecraft versus positive tools. I mean, we didn't choose this, but we're in the most intense period of geopolitical competition, arguably, since the Cold War, maybe going all the way back to World War II. And, both Russia and China are challenging the U.S.-led order. We're pushing back. A number of countries are trying to figure out how they want to align themselves. And that's going to be a period of protracted uncertainty. And let's hope, because the great powers that we're in competition with are also nuclear powers, let's hope that the competition doesn't veer into conflict. And the whole world knows that we have been using sanctions and export controls with more frequency and potency than ever before. But that doesn't win hearts and minds. And we would not want to have a narrative take hold that we're simply focused and spending all of our time and energy on developing the tools that impose economic pain, that break linkages in the global economy, whether it's in trade or capital flows or technological diffusion. I think we've got to have a standing preference for the use of tools that offer the prospect of mutual economic gain. And we have a number of tools on the shelf that we just haven't used with the same frequency and potency as we have the more punitive tools. So think of debt relief or concessional lending. We have sovereign loan guarantees, but we've only used them 6 times in the past 30 years. We have something akin to a sovereign wealth fund in the Exchange Stabilization Fund at Treasury. Could we reimagine it to make long-term strategic investments in the developing world? We have a strategic petroleum reserve, and it was designed when we were net importers of petroleum. Well, now we're net exporters, and what we really need are critical minerals and refined products. Could this petroleum reserve be refashioned as a strategic resilience reserve? And again, make investments at home and abroad, particularly in developing countries that have essential clean energy inputs. I could go on, but what I'm saying is, if we have a focus over the next, let's hope, 4+ years on developing, reimagining, and refining the positive tools of economic statecraft, that gives us our best chance of forging an enduring alignment with those geopolitical swing states that right now want to do more business with the U.S. They want to have a deeper economic relationship, and they're looking for our value proposition to improve.
If one was looking at a place a year ago where economic diplomacy could have actually been a really positive force in building a basis for peace, it would have been the Middle East, and it would have been that whole discussion around Saudi Arabia's normalization of relations with Israel that we were so close to before October 7th. I just wonder, do you feel that economic path to peace in the region is now completely dead?
We can't let it be. We can't let this remain a zero-sum, intractable conflict over that takes place over land. We have to transform it into a positive-sum economic conversation. Ultimately, that's the only way for a sustainable peace to emerge. And it has to start, of course, with a ceasefire and a hostage deal, but it has to lead to a normalization process that involves a lot of the tools we've been talking about already in the reconstruction of Gaza and the creation of a more positive dynamic. That's the only way I can think of to transform what has been just an outright tragedy for everyone involved over the past 8 months.
But there's a lot of people who will now not want to come to the table or consider the US to be a good broker of that kind of deal, given what's happened in Gaza.
I still think diplomacy is never dead. The deal space with Saudi Arabia remains very wide. We have very senior officials over there almost every other week. And if we can find a way to get a cessation of the conflict and a release of the hostages and a political discussion emerges from it, this is going to take years and years to unfold, and we're still the last best chance for the region to find a way forward.
this is a guy who is clearly carrying a lot on his shoulders. And I've got to know him a little bit over the last couple of years because he was so focused on some of the issues that I'm interested in, that interplay between economics and politics. But, he's the one who's actually living it day to day, some of those really difficult trade-offs where what the answer is from a national security perspective may be very different from what an economist would say.
And also very interesting to hear you both discuss that they use a lot of sticks, but they've got to get better at what the carrots are. And he accepted that as a point, but it wasn't obvious that they actually had many carrots in the fridge.
Just before he went back into the administration, he'd written an article that was very much along those lines, saying you need to have a more positive offer for the world.
But that's tricky, Steph, isn't it? Because we're at this point, not only this point in the US electoral cycle where so much of their economic policy is protectionist. What do they have to play with? Did you get that sense from talking to him that they had nice offers?
Well, I think he would admit it's a challenge. Because and as he said, it's easier to do the sticks than the carrots, especially if you have a not very supportive Congress. Look how hard it was to get the Ukraine aid package through Congress. But to some extent, it's about still wanting to be in the American club in that circle of countries. And you would think that lots of countries would want to be part of that. But as we've pointed out many times, actually playing both sides, being in the middle, can be quite an attractive place for policymakers to be right now. And I'm not sure that anyone can really address that sitting in the White House, or not anytime soon, especially looking at what's happening in the Middle East, which is where we ended that conversation. I mean, it does not, so far, is not making the case for positive economic diplomacy, to say the least. Thanks for listening to this week's Voternomics from Bloomberg. This episode was hosted by me, Stephanie Flanders, and Allegra Stratton. It was produced by Summer Sadi with help from Chris Marklew. Sound design by Moses Andam and Blake Maples. Brendan Francis Noonan is our executive producer, and Sage Bowman is head of podcasts. Special thanks this week to Daleep Singh and Ruchi Bhatia. Please, if you like the show, subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends wherever you listen to podcasts.